Idaho Matters podcast is brought to you by St. Luke's On-Demand Virtual Care, which allows patients to see a provider from their home using a computer or smartphone with on-demand care for common ailments, such as a cough, sore throat, or a sinus issue. More information at stlukesonline.org. Idaho Matters is taking a deep dive into the loss of farmland here in the Gem State. Are you a farmer? What challenges do you face as farmland shrinks in Idaho? We want to hear your story. Email us at idahomatters@boisestate.edu or leave us a voicemail using the Talk to Us feature in the Boise State Public Radio app. And then listen to our series on farming called Land and Legacy. Episodes available on Monday afternoons in the Idaho Matters podcast feed. From the studios of Boise State Public Radio News, I'm Gemma Gaudette. This is Idaho Matters, and it's Friday, which means it's time for our Reporter Roundtable. We'll spend the next hour getting you updated on the news that made headlines this last week. Our panel today includes Clark Corbin and Laura Guido with the Idaho Capital Sun, as well as Brian Clark, Idaho Statesman opinion writer. And today we are beginning with Clark Corbin. So, hi, Clark.
Happy Friday, Gemma. How's it going?
Good. How are you? Happy Friday to you. So Clark, I want to talk about what was Idaho's once record-breaking budget surplus, because it has flipped into the red. This is according to new state budget documents. Idaho is now projected to end the current fiscal year with an unconstitutional deficit of nearly $57 million. Now, this is a big reversal from the $2 billion, yes, that's with a B, surplus just 3 years ago. Now, Governor Little has already ordered 3% spending cuts across state agency. This does exclude public schools, and it says that those cuts will continue and possibly deepen to bring the budget back into balance. Now, in the meantime, Democrats in the legislature are blaming Republican tax cuts and this new education tax credit for driving down our state revenue. Now, the governor's office insists Idaho's economy is strong, and they say they're taking steps to avoid any deficit. So, Clark, you cover the legislature very closely. You also cover Idaho's budget in depth. So I want to dig into this in this segment. So first off, how serious is this projected $56.6 million deficit? And what makes it unconstitutional under Idaho law?
Yeah, for sure, Gemma. Thanks. I'm glad we get to spend a few minutes today talking about this. I think it is serious because it's one of the few requirements that the Idaho legislature has. And that's why we get into talking about a projected budget deficit would be unconstitutional. And so what does that mean? Idaho's constitution requires that every year the state pass a balanced budget where the expenses do not exceed the available revenues. It's a very different picture than what we have with the federal government, right? But in Idaho, there's actually a requirement in the state constitution where you have to pass a balanced budget every year. And so I think that's why it's serious. But the good news is at this point, it's still just a projection. Idaho runs on a fiscal year calendar that doesn't end until June of 2026. And so we have data from 3 months, basically the first quarter of the fiscal year that we're in right now, which is in the 2026 fiscal year. And it's exactly like you said, Gemma, the latest budget documents released by the state of Idaho show that if everything continues as expected, the legislature, the budget would end the fiscal year in June with that deficit of $57 million. And that takes into account already the impact of those 3% cuts. So it is serious, but the good news is that it hasn't happened yet. And there's still time for Governor Little and the Idaho legislature to take action to prevent a deficit. And I do totally believe that the governor and the legislature will take steps to prevent a budget deficit from actually happening because it is prevented by the Constitution. And I think the most likely steps that they will take would be additional cuts. I don't think it's realistic in Idaho in 2025 that they would talk about raising taxes to increase revenue. So I think that what we would be looking at is additional is additional cuts to prevent that budget deficit from happening. That could happen by action from the governor, or that could happen when the legislature reconvenes in January for the
Mhm.
2026 legislative session. They'll also be taking a close look at the budget, Jim, at that time.
Well, and Clark, I have to say, for people who have lived in Idaho for a very long time, I think this is shocking. I don't think there's a better word for it, that we are even talking about a deficit in Idaho's budget. Uh, I think something that Idaho has prided itself on for generations is that, as we know, Clark, many red states run in the red. Idaho does not run in the red. So when you talk about the fact that we're looking at deeper cuts, first off, I'd kind of like your thoughts on, since you do cover the legislature, really how unprecedented this is to even be having conversations about a deficit. But also the governor, as I mentioned, already made those 3% cuts. So where would the cuts come from if we're looking at deeper cuts, or do we even have an idea?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm not sure where the cuts would come from. Right now, the governor has directed all the state agencies, other than public schools, like you said, Gemma, to come up with the cuts on their own and to identify the areas where they could cut and maybe have the smallest impact. But you're right that it is a big change. You're right that just 3 years ago, Idaho had a record-breaking $2 billion budget surplus, and that Idaho had so much money on hand that they called a special session to figure out what to do with all that money. And so just 3 years later, we're in a very different situation. And you're right, Idaho had always prided itself on, you can pick whatever adjective you want to use here, but the common word I heard is responsible budget practices over the 15 years
Mm-hmm.
that I've covered the legislature, about being responsible and prudent in our spending, and being responsible in setting our budget. And so there still is time to take steps. And there's also time, we're early enough in the fiscal year, Gemma, where this could either get worse or this could correct itself and get better. There is also additional concern out there on the horizon that this projected budget deficit, easy for me to say, the projected deficit doesn't include conforming to some of the tax changes in the One Big Beautiful Bill
Mm.
that President Trump and Congress passed this summer. And it also doesn't include the cost of something like 90 to $100 million in supplemental funding requests. And so when I talk to Democrats in the Idaho legislature, particularly Senator Melissa Wintrow from Boise and Representative Alana Rubel, also from Boise, two Democrats, they're very concerned about the budget. They say it's extremely irresponsible. They blame the Republicans and Governor Little for passing $450 million worth of tax cuts and a new education tax credit this last year.
Mm-hmm.
And to pay for the new tax cuts and the education tax credit, the legislature reduced revenue by $450 million. And so the Democrats are blaming the Republicans. Some of the Republicans that I've talked to, like Representative Wendy Horman from Idaho Falls, who's the co-chair of the Budget Committee, says it's just a projection. We're early in the fiscal year. The most important months come later in the year when we get into tax season, right? When folks are filing
Mm-hmm.
their tax returns, when businesses are filing their tax returns. And so Representative Horman is saying that the state economy is well positioned overall, that we're not in a recession, that we have record savings accounts built up, and that it's not time to panic, and that we shouldn't be worked up into a frenzy over a projection. And so kind of the
Mm.
reaction I'm getting sort of depends on who I ask. And that's not super
Yeah.
surprising, Gemma, right? In this partisan, hyper political world that we live in 2025. But it is early enough in the year that it could get better or it could get worse. But there
Yeah.
is continued concern about some of the cost of those tax changes from the One Big Beautiful Bill and some of these supplemental funding requests. And so I think that it's
Mm-hmm.
going to continue to be a story. I think it'll be a story when the legislature reconvenes in January. And if these budget if these revenue shortfalls continue, if revenues continue to come in below projections, it could be a story in the 2026 elections when we have the governor and all 105 seats in the legislature up for election next year. I think this could be a big discussion point,
Mm-hmm.
something that folks are following closely. Because when we talk about the budget, we're talking about things like money for Idaho State Police. We're talking about money for our court system, money for these water infrastructure projects, money for health and welfare programs, money for public schools. And so that's why the budget is watched so closely. And I know it gets tricky talking about millions and billions of dollars, but we're really talking about funding for programs that affect Idahoans' lives all over the state,
Yeah.
no matter what community that they live in. And so that's why we pay attention to what's happening at the budget and why we kind of scrutinize these reports
Mm-hmm.
that show how are we doing since the legislative session adjourned in April? What are things looking at? And so that's why we try to take a close look at these types of things, Gemma.
Well, and quickly, Clark, can we talk about this new education tax credit for a moment? As you mentioned, Democrats are blaming not just the Republican tax policies, but this new education tax credit that's set to begin in
Yeah.
January. There is a court case going on, so it's kind of in flux right now. But this is $50 million in the budget that's been set aside for this. The projected deficit is almost $57 million. So, you could make a correlation to that. With that said, if this is implemented, this first round, I mean, I know that there's been, everyone says this is a tax credit, but
Yeah.
the new law states that if you apply for this and you get this tax credit, that there is an opportunity at the very first time that you will get that $5,000 per child to actually pay for tuition, right? So you're going to actually potentially get money in the first year. And then after that, it's a tax credit. So, Clark, if this goes into effect and then we have revenues that are forecasted coming in 7% below what's forecasted, I mean, I realize that we have legislators saying, don't panic, don't worry. But there is rightfully just some places to kind of scratch your head and wonder, well, maybe we should be concerned a little bit.
Yeah, when I talked to the two Democratic legislators that I mentioned, Senator Winthrop from Boise and Representative Rubel from Boise, they've told me that in the budget environment that we find ourselves in, it's irresponsible to move forward with implementing the education tax credit. They're saying that we can't afford it right now with this projected budget deficit. And so both of those Democrats have said that we need to get rid of that could help alleviate our budget problems. But I think on the other hand, if you look at some of the conservative Republicans in the legislature, they might pick out other programs where they would like to cut funding. For instance, this summer, the state of Idaho reduced its Medicaid reimbursement rate that it pays for providers. It reduced that rate by 4%. And so I think, again, talking about this partisan world that we live in, I think that there's many different ideas on if it comes to cutting, where could we apply the cuts to both alleviate the budget deficit and go from there. So yeah, the Democrats have definitely talked about this new program, the education tax credit. If we have a deficit, we can't afford it. But conservative Republicans have talked about, well, Medicaid is the largest expense that the state has at this point, and we could cut that, or we could cut Governor Little's Idaho Launch Program is another proposal that I've seen put forward by some conservative Republicans. And so they are starting to have those conversations now about if we have additional cuts, if we have to take additional steps to ensure that we don't have a budget deficit, where could we cut? What would that look like? And so I think a lot of those conversations, Gemma, are going to continue. But you're right that folks have keyed in on the new education tax credit. I think largely because it's new and because of the amounts of funding being similar levels there, Gemma.
And we don't know at this point what it will really look like in the budget. With that said, The legislative session begins in 3 months. I know you will be covering
Yeah.
it, and we will be and we'll be coming to you to talk more about the budget. So, Laura, we're finding out that Idaho's top leaders were caught off guard when Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth announced a military training center for Qatar would be built in Idaho. This happened late last week, and Laura, you've been covering this story since it broke. Can we begin with the basics? I mean, what exactly did Hegseth announce, and why did it catch Idaho's top leaders off guard?
Right. So last week, the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, he said that the U.S. had entered a deal with Qatar to build a facility at the Mountain Home Air Force Base where Qatari pilots could train, and then they'd also house F-15 variants that the U.S. had already said that they would sell to the country. Um, Basically, it seems like some of the top officials for Idaho did not know that that announcement was coming necessarily. I
Mm-hmm.
obtained some public records through a records request, basically showing that the top staff members for the governor and U.S. Senator Jim Risch were. It was news to them just as much as everyone else once the media started reporting on the announcement.
Yeah, my understanding is that you were able to, through a public records request, obtain text messages between the governor's and the senator's top aides, and these text messages showed that they were surprised. Um, so what stood out to you, Laura, about those messages? I mean, what did they reveal, I guess, about the communication or the lack of it between federal and state officials?
Yeah, I mean, there weren't a lot of texts included in my records request, but from what I saw, I mean, I didn't have to necessarily guess that this was news to them. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
one of them was from the first one was from Senator Risch's chief of staff, and it was basically an attachment with an article announcing the deal, and he just wrote, "This was news to us." And the chief of staff for
Mm.
Governor Little responded, "Same." So there wasn't a lot of guesswork there in terms of
So
the fact that they didn't see this coming.
So, Laura, how unusual is it for a major international defense training deal like this to be announced without notifying state leaders first?
You know, that's a good question. I think a lot of like state legislators have kind of raised that question as well. I actually called Butch Otter because he was there when Singapore uh,
Mm-hmm.
was housed at the Mountain Home Air Force Base. And, you know, I asked him if he's aware of it. And he said he remembered going to the Air Force Base and greeting their commander when they came, but he said he really couldn't remember. I mean, that was in 2008. So he really couldn't remember what his involvement was ahead of time, and he really
Mm.
couldn't speak to that. So it's kind of hard to say. I also haven't really been able to get in touch with folks from the Mountain Home Air Force Base, and kind of other communication about this has been
Mm-hmm.
limited. So it's hard to say.
So you mentioned Singapore. Senator Risch actually later on, after this announcement, called the deal in line with existing U.S. military partnerships, like the one with Singapore. So in the reporting that you did, does that comparison seem accurate based on what you've seen in the documents and prior agreements?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that partnership has been going on for a long time, and obviously you don't hear about it that much. And I think the difference here is Qatar is more of a controversial figure. In
Mm-hmm.
2017, President Trump, in his first term, called Qatar a high-level sponsor of terrorism. Um, but also they were a pretty key partner in recent negotiations between Israel and Hamas. So, you know, there's kind of mixed messages getting sent. A lot of people have really focused more on the fact that Qatar is he's a controversial figure. Similar criticism has been made with similar agreements with Saudi Arabia as well.
So there has been a lot of public concern since this announcement was made a week ago about whether Qatar is building a military base in Idaho. So, Laura, what have you learned about what's actually set to be built at Mountain Home Air Force Base?
Right. Hegseth has clarified that it's not a base that's being built, but basically the plans are for dorms and hangars for the troops and their jets that the U.S. already sold them. Um, to be on at the Mountain Home Air Force Base. The U.S. has said it will retain full control and ownership of the structures as well as the base as a whole.
Mhm. Okay, so finally, do we know what's next? I mean, are there any upcoming briefings or local hearings or next steps in the process that Idahoans should be watching for?
Um, like I said, information has been pretty limited on it. I mean, it
Hmm.
took folks a while to comment on it at all. I think it's important to note that this did not come out of nowhere. I mean, it's been reported like in 2017, it was announced that they'd sell the jets to Qatar. And then
Hmm.
an environmental impact statement was done on a potential building facilities at the base in 2022. But in terms of what's next, the message from Governor Little and the congressional delegation has basically been that they're trying to stay in communication with Hegseth and the administration, and they'll try and raise concerns brought up by the community. But I haven't seen anything on the schedule in terms of press conference or briefing or anything like that.
All right, appreciate that report. So, Brian, you recently wrote an opinion piece in the Idaho Statesman about tomorrow's upcoming No Kings protest. For people who might not have heard of this yet, what exactly is the No Kings movement? And then what's planned for these demonstrations here in Idaho?
The No Kings movement is a nationwide set of protests that have gone on towards the increasing level of authoritarianism in the United States. The first major round of nationwide protests occurred in June, and there's a follow-up set that will take place this Saturday. They're playing kind of all over Idaho, in all the major metropolitan areas, but also in a number of smaller cities, places like Arco, Rexburg, places like that.
So, Brian, you opened your column by saying that protests do matter and that they're serious, they're important work. What made you want to write this piece right now, and why focus on the No Kings protests specifically?
Well, the No Kings protests have been the largest set of protests and the most effective, the most attention grabbing of the protests and efforts to combat the slide towards authoritarianism in the United States. You could even argue that they've been more effective than the Democrats' shutdown in capturing attention. Um, and so for that reason, they present kind of unique opportunities to build relationships, to lay the groundwork for effective resistance toward more authoritarian steps on behalf that the president has been taking.
Hmm. You know, you drew a connection between civic protest and protecting democracy, and you pointed out South Korea as an example where citizens actually stopped a slide into dictatorship through mass protests. So I'm curious to know, what lessons do you think Americans, but Idahoans in particular, can take away from that comparison that you made in this piece?
Well, the South Korean example was interesting because it was effective, and what made it effective was how quickly mass protests materialized. So the elected president of South Korea, who had lost his parliamentary majority, declared martial law in December, deployed troops across the country, imposed media censorship, a whole host of authoritarian moves. And within 6 hours, that all had to be reversed. He was quickly removed from the presidency. His successor was removed from the presidency as well, and they're both facing trial right now. Or I'm sorry, his successor is not. He is. But the what made it so effective, the reason that martial law lasted for 6 hours is because people were ready. One of the reasons that people in South Korea were ready is that South Korea has a much longer history of repression and a much
Mm.
more recent history of political repression than the United States does. And so that because of that, people were ready to go. In the United States, there has not been, especially in places like Idaho, such a recent history of political repression. And so that makes things like No Kings important because it sort of works those muscles, gets people ready for if more draconian actions take place in the United States.
Mhm. Well, Brian, some people feel that protesting in a deeply conservative state like Idaho doesn't change anything. Um, but when we look at the first No Kings protest that happened over the summer, the thing that stood out to me, was the incredibly large crowd in Boise, but also the fact that there were protests all over the state and in much more red areas of the state. And and I kind of anecdotally was like, there's no way that there's that many Democrats in the state of Idaho. So when you see a protest that large, it's not just partisan. So I'm curious about what kind of argument you would make, to someone saying like, is it going to even do anything in a deeply red state like Idaho?
Well, yeah, I'd say it's important for a couple of reasons. One thing is that there isn't universal support for some of the actions President Trump has taken among Republicans. About half of Republicans nationally oppose the idea of deploying the National Guard to cities around the country. So that's not a highly popular move even among Republicans. And on top of that, if you go to the reddest part of Idaho, Madison County, near Rexburg, about 1 in 5 people there did not vote for President Trump. They voted for someone else. In statewide, it's about 1 in 3 people voted against President Trump. So it's a minority position, but it's hardly a tiny position. Lots of people feel that way. And the No Kings protests, among other things, are ways to connect with more people who share those views.
And this is a nationwide protest that is set for tomorrow, correct?
Yes, yes, and there's
Okay.
there's a website you can go to, and there's almost certainly a protest within an hour or two drive wherever you live in the state.
So, Clark, Idaho officials just broke ground on a new $20 million dam that will be built on the Boise River. I'm curious about how this project rose to the top of the list for state water infrastructure funding.
Yeah, for sure, Jim. And thanks. It's right over by Barber Park, which I think a lot of people listening today will know is the point where they begin their summer float of the Boise River. It's the dam just upstream of Barber Park, and it's operated by the Nampa and Meridian Irrigation District. And the purpose is to divert water off the Boise River into a series of canals that kind of bring irrigation water to farms and lawns all across the Treasure Valley. And I think the reason that it sort of rose to the top in terms of the priority list of water projects is because there's a 100-year-old existing diversion dam there that has kind of come to the end of its life. And so for several years, the members of this irrigation district have been looking at replacing it and looking at modernizing and upgrading it. And they were able to get some grants from the Bureau of Reclamation and get I think about $10 million in state funding set aside by Governor Little and the Idaho legislature out of this larger pot of money made available for water infrastructure projects. But yeah, it's about a $20 million project. They're going to replace the old infrastructure from the existing dam. Over the next 2 years, they're going to be doing work in the winter so that they won't be affecting the summer float season. So basically, Gemma, what's going to happen is they're starting right now working from one side of the river, and they're going to work all winter, replacing and upgrading the dam. And then they're going to put it back together in the spring to allow for the normal Boise River float season will take place next summer. They won't be doing any construction on the dam next summer in order to let the float season take place. And then this time next year, when float season ends, they'll go to the other side of the river and work across the other way. And then the goal is to finish it up in 2027, once again before the river floating season begins. So they're trying to stay away from the popular summer floating season. I think anybody who spent any amount of time in the Treasure Valley has either floated the Boise River or known somebody who has. I think there's more than 100,000 people every summer that float that stretch of the river. So it's just downstream from this 100-year-old dam that they'll be replacing. And I went out on Tuesday and took a look at the dam on the river. And it's kind of interesting, Gemma. It's 100 years old, like I said. And one of the things they do to actually raise the water level and divert it into the canal is they have these teams of 3 people that have to walk out over this kind of sketchy, narrow walkway on the river. And they're carrying these 20-foot long boards, and they actually insert the boards into the dam. And that's how they raise the river water and to divert it into the canal. What's going to happen is they're going to replace all of that infrastructure with a new automated system. It's going to have these automatic gates that can be opened and closed. And so once it's complete, they're not going to have folks having to go out and manually put in these 20-foot long boards in the dam every time they want to change the water level. So it's going to have this automated gate system. And then the folks with the irrigation company have partnered with the Idaho Department of Fish and Game, and they're actually going to put screens on the outside of the dam, and it's going to prevent adult fish from entering into the dam where they could be killed or hurt. And so there is a component to trying to protect the fish that are in the Boise River through these new, basically like a screen, basically a guard that's going to go across on the outside of the dam. And it's specifically designed to prevent adult fish from going into the dam where they could be hurt or killed.
So, Clark, so I'm picturing, for folks who know the Boise area, is it that dam that's there right now that's really off of Eckert Road? Like it's the one where they've had to recently replace that bridge when you're going
that's
to Barber
exactly
Park?
It's on Eckert Road, right by Barber Park, right by the bridge there. And I think the bridge is either under construction or about to be under construction. That's a separate project, but you're exactly right. It's right off Eckert Road, right by Barber Park, right by that bridge, right by where folks put into that's kind of the traditional start of the Boise River float that folks may know.
So you mentioned fish protection measures that that will be happening. Have they done any other like specific environmental reviews about this new dam and that impact, if any?
Yeah, they have, and that's actually something that I don't know too much about, but I know that that was part of the process when they talked about there's conservation easements in the area. They talked about these environmental impact studies that they had to do. They had to submit a bunch of paperwork with their application, and I don't have all the details about what all that entailed, but they did say they were able to work through it successfully to get the plans to go ahead. But I do know that the fish screens in particular are part of that effort. And I know also avoiding the summer floating and recreation season on the Boise River was part of that. I don't know all the details, but they did mention there were conservation easements. They had to work with a number of different entities, including the city, including the Bureau of Reclamation in terms of the paperwork and the submissions they did for the grants. But I think that's actually something I'd like to follow up a little bit more on as we get into the construction of the project, which, like I said, is going to be taking place this winter and then next winter as well. So I'll try to dig up some more information about that to share the next time, Gemma.
And Clark, how about farms and homes? I mean, do we know how many of them depend on irrigation water from the Rhinebeck Canal, and then how this project will make a difference for them?
Yeah, Governor Little was actually out there for the groundbreaking on Tuesday, and he said this diversion dam is like a powerhouse for the Treasure Valley. And one of the things that he said is that farmers have been depending on this dam for almost 100 years, and this new upgrade, this new modernization project will make it so that farmers throughout the Treasure Valley can depend on having the water reach them going forward. I don't know exactly how many people it serves, but the irrigation district itself covers about 69,000 acres across the Treasure Valley. So it's thousands of acres of farmland and many different customers. The water in this case that we're talking about that's being diverted through the canal, it's all irrigation water. So it's all for watering crops, for watering lawns. They mentioned some athletic fields, football fields, soccer fields are watered with this water, but it's not drinking water. It's irrigation water only. But yeah, Governor Little described it as this dam's been a powerhouse for 100 years, and that going through with this project will ensure that farmers and landowners all throughout the Treasure Valley will be able to continue to count on receiving their water. The folks had basically told me that a bunch of this infrastructure went in place in the 1930s. It's come to the end of its useful lifespan. And they talked about how it was just kind of unsafe having those crews walk out on the sort of catwalk over the dam to manually put those boards over. They talked about even if it's in the winter, even if the walkway is iced over, they would still have to call crews out to manually put those boards in. And so once it's all said and done, like I said, it'll have that automated component of it with those gates. And so folks aren't going to actually have to go over and kind of take that sketchy walk out over the Boise River to operate it manually. So it sounds like a more modern system, and being able to ensure that these farmers that had depended on the water will be able to continue to do so. I know I've been on a lot over the last really year and a half, 2 years, Jim, talking about some of the water issues that have affected our farmers and some of the concern about aquifer levels and things like that. And so the legislature and the governor have sort of this heightened awareness about water and the role that water plays in our economy because of this agricultural background and backbone, really, that Idaho has, Gemma.
So, Laura, you recently wrote a quite in-depth article about Idaho's foster care system and how some advocates are fearing that abuse is getting worse for kids who are in this system. And they are blaming some new laws that are in effect. And your story does show that less children are entering foster care, but the cases are getting more severe. So do you know what's driving that shift?
Yeah, so not every region is seeing a decrease in the number of foster care children entering foster care, but there is a decrease in some regions, especially North Idaho and North Central Idaho. They've seen a pretty prominent decrease. And but every CASA, which stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate, every leader of those programs that I talked to all around the state said they were seeing more severe cases of abuse entering the system, and not necessarily more cases of abuse. I looked at the data on that, and that's held pretty steady, but the cases that are coming in just are more serious than, and a lot of these folks have been in this program for a long time. They said that the last couple of years they've seen some of the worst cases that they've ever seen.
So Laura,
and honestly, it's complicated in terms of what's all the factors leading to that.
So Laura, I'm curious, are the CASA volunteers or even social workers saying that this change happened after the pandemic, or is it more connected to recent policy shifts?
So many of them said that they definitely saw things getting worse during the pandemic. It was really a major factor with children not going to school, staying in the home. There just were fewer other adults with eyes on them. And in Idaho, every adult is a mandatory reporter, but obviously teachers are spending the most time with children. They're an important part of that. And in cases of abuse, it tends to get worse over time the longer a child stays in that situation. And it can sometimes be normalized for that child, which can delay them disclosing it to someone else. But
so,
the problem
Laura, there was
that it wasn't getting better. Sorry to cut you off.
Oh, no, no, it's okay. Continue.
Yeah, what I was hearing is that they definitely saw things getting worse. But the thing is, we're now here toward the end of 2025 and things still aren't getting better.
So I have about a little bit more than a minute left with you, so I apologize for the lack of time, but I did want to get into this 2024 court ruling that changed how police can remove children from homes. Are these advocates saying that that decision has also impacted what's going on?
Yes, basically, a federal judge ruled that it violated parents' constitutional rights when a sheriff's office detective removed their child without a warrant. And the impact has been a lot of law enforcement agencies, in order to protect their liability, have taken a big step back from this role of removing children from homes. And there's been, since that decision happened, there has been a very steep decline in the number of children entering foster care because of a law enforcement removal.
So, folks, we're out of time, but if you want to read Laura's article, and I would urge you to do that, it is in the Idaho Capital Sun. It's quite in depth about what's going on within the foster care system. And of course, you can also read everything that Clark Corbin has written at the Idaho Capital Sun and Brian Clark's opinion piece with the Idaho Statesman as well. You've been listening to Idaho Matters from Boise State Public Radio. I'm Gemma Gaudet.
Stay connected with Boise State Public Radio on Instagram. From breaking news and local stories to behind-the-scenes videos, it's where our community comes together. Follow Boise State Public Radio today.